Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for being here. I'm Christina Olson, the co-chair of the University of Michigan Arts Initiative, and also the director of UMA, the University of Michigan's Museum of Art. The Future of Art series is a program of the Arts Initiative, and it's a series that aims to bring experts of all kinds together to consider and wrestle with key questions and issues of how the arts grow and evolve in the face of wide-scale changes and crises across the globe. This is the 5th program in the series. If there's a program or topic you'd especially like to see us tackle, please get in touch with us. We're always looking for new ideas. Today's event is called The Future of Art, Repair or Rebuild. And it arose from multiple conversations that I'd say I've been having over the last couple of years with colleagues about the state of art museums and how they need to change to survive or to matter or to gain or regain public trust. It asks, can art museums, many of whose roots are soaked in colonialism and the theft of objects, be repaired, or do they have to be dismantled? And it recognizes that that question isn't itself new. The racism, the misogyny, and elitism embedded in many art museums has been pointed out by for decades by organizations like the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, the Art Workers Coalition, Women Artists in Revolution, and by hundreds of museum workers themselves, especially museum educators, I would point out. Our program will start today with a short overviews from each of our 3 panelists, followed by a panel discussion by the 4 of us. And then after about 20 minutes of that, we'll open it up to questions from all of you, which you can introduce using the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Allison Rivet, Amanda Bynum, Laura Morris, Rosie Murphy, and Allison Cornell for their hard work in making this event possible. Now I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists. Marita Poole is director and curator of the museum at Clark Atlanta University, an HBCU, whose collection focuses on Black artists of the mid-20th century. Her PhD is from Emory University in anthropology, and she has worked as a curator at Williams College Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum for African Art, and Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. Terrence Washington is program director at Next Haven, a model to advance the careers of artists and curators of color through mentorship and professional development. He worked in the education department at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. after receiving his master's degree in art history from Williams College. And Anya Sirota is associate professor of architecture and associate dean of academic initiatives at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Through her design firm, Akoaki, she explores the intersection of design and social enterprise to rethink the urban landscape. She received her master's in architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Marita Poole will start us off.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you everyone for attending this panel about the future of art museums. It is my pleasure to be a part of this today and to talk about my perspectives that were developed by working at a teaching museum at a historically Black college in the American South. Clark Atlanta University Art Museum is distinctive because it was started by African-American artists in the 1940s. And also it exists within a complex of institutions within the Atlanta area. So often that our work is done in conversation with the work of Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, which is within 1 mile of our institution, Morehouse College, Morris Brown, and the Interdenominational Theological Center. So I look forward to discussing my perspectives about the ways in which contemporary Black artists in the American South are being presented at our institution in relation to the developments of African-American artists in the 20th century, and also considering what some of their concerns and ideas are that may not be discussed as in depth as they could be on the national, in the national scene. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation, Tina, and to the staff at U of M who are making this happen. Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. I am at this point where I'm trying to figure out what the through line is for my sort of career, but also my thinking about um, museums and art institutions and their publics. And I sort of started out as someone who'd never really grown up in a museum, and from the beginning felt very strongly that that was a problem because these things are held, objects are held in the public trust. And so by now, in a relatively short time, I've been at the National Gallery of Art, and I've been at a very small sort of startup environment in Next Haven. And ultimately, the sort of through line for me is I think it's important to ask who our audiences are for the various things that we do. And we find often that people can't really answer that question. And then at the same time, I think I'm interested lately in how private interests turn into public good. What does the public trust look like as a sort of legal understanding between people who have a lot of capital and objects, and between them and between our public, and then who is that? So yeah, I'm excited to be here to talk about these things.
Thanks for passing it along, Terrence. It's great to be in such good company. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I'm not from the space of curation or museum studies, so I feel a little bit out of my normal realm or territory. But my scholarship in the past, for the past decade or so, has focused on the idea of cultural infrastructure more broadly than museum studies per se, but I've looked to all kinds of ways that cultural infrastructure can sponsor collective activity, can foster a sense of self-expression, social cohesion, and I've looked to urban typologies that might be that might meet the needs of all sorts of populations that don't normally get addressed by classical museums or encyclopedic museums. And one of these has been the civic friche typology in France, which is a combination of post-industrial appropriation and strategies for regeneration in complex economic environments. And it's one that I've embraced with some level of fondness for its capacity to support undoneness in the urban realm, or programmatic open-endedness and public participation and informalism. In addition to my scholarship, my creative practice in the shape of this speculative experimental studio Akuaki has investigated all sorts of ideas around what cultural infrastructure can look like. In our early days, which I like to fondly call pre-legal or activist, but really it was an interventionist practice at that point, we were motivated by this idea that ephemeral transformation could foster public participation and shape the way our cultural infrastructure might look. And it was a kind of light-footed strategy for us to test ideas in the public realm. An example of this was a project called Interrobang, just to give you a sense of scale, where we staged a gallery on the roof of the Detroit Packard plant in order to gather feedback and speculate about alternate future possibilities for a building that was about to go up on the auction block. Or sometimes we would build sort of plywood, poor man's Anish Kapoor installations in the shape of General Manifold at Federal Screwworks plant in Chelsea, Michigan, where we were trying to make a case for creating cultural infrastructure where there was none in a small town by transforming the sort of visual and perspectival possibilities. And then as we matured, we realized that space itself wasn't enough, that we would need to focus on governance, and the possibilities of building parallel institutions. It's kind of a term that we borrowed from the political philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis. And here we started to work with a plethora of artists and community leaders to look for, let's say, emancipatory possibilities of creating temporary institutions that could perhaps inflect what more traditional or more legal institutions might look like in the future. So this has has amounted to a group of projects and experiments that were featured in the Saint-Étienne Design Biennale, but ultimately tested the possibilities of people from different disciplines, different perspectives working together. And in the most recent iteration of our practice, we've taken those lessons and attempted to apply them to a larger urban scale project, the Detroit Cultural Center Planning Initiative, which in partnership with the Paris-based Agence Terre, looks to unify 12 autonomous, variably scaled, very different institutions in Midtown Detroit and bring them to the table as a coherent, continuous landscape. And that includes big institutions like the DIA, Detroit Public Library, venerable colleges and universities, Wayne State, our very own U of M, and then smaller institutions that might be struggling for a bit of visibility or for a place in this district, like the International Institute or the Hellenic Museum, much smaller in scale. So all of this to say that in all of the projects that we've worked on, I'm very much an outsider to both the discipline of museum studies, but also, you know, a sidebar confessional. I'm an ex-Soviet, a naturalized American citizen, more recently a French adoptee through my professional and life affiliation with an autodidactic social anarchist, my partner. And we occupy this position of paradigmatic otherness in order to stay distanced, critical, comparative, culturally. However flawed that position is, we're always looking for experiments of how people can work together in novel and effective ways. So delighted to be part of this conversation today.
Thanks to all three of you. That's really, really rich overview of very different but overlapping practices and ideas. I think we're going to have a really rich conversation. I would like to start us off with a question for all three of you, and I think it's the kind of big question, and all three of you kind of signaled toward it, but that is, you know, if we were just going to start building a list of ideas and topics for what has to change for institutions, and by institutions, we mostly are talking about art museums today, to matter, to survive and matter. And I recognize that those two verbs are different also. What they may need to do to survive may be different than what they have to do to matter. And I heard a little bit of that in some of what Anya was describing in terms of speculative solutions. But what has to be different, or what has to be, how do museums have to evolve or be dismantled, to the title of our program today, in order to represent their communities more fully and complexly, in order to gain or regain the trust of those communities, in order to survive and thrive. Terrence, do you want to just start us off with some thoughts?
Sure. This is kind of abstract, but I think that to survive, museums have to be willing to be unrecognizable to themselves. I think we want them to survive in the form that they've always held. And there's something that they've been trying to get at with that form that we want, and some aspects of the form we don't want. And so I think getting down to what these things are for, and sort of, I'd love to get rid of the idea that their mere existence sort of justifies itself. I think they need to appeal to a broader public. I've been thinking a lot about Andrea Fraser's book, 2016 in Museums, Money and Politics. That sort of shows the ways that museums mimic and are invested in the sort of plutocratic structure of the broader government. And I think that getting away from that arrangement, believing that a few wealthy people can broadly represent the interests of a much more diverse and differently classed body of people is really the way to go. We've given a lot of trust to people who have let us down. Let's take it back.
Anya, what are your thoughts?
Terrence, I'm inspired by your idea of an unrecognizable institution. I was thinking about it through the idea of embracing self-reflexive partiality. If institutions begin to admit that they can only present a fragment of an incomplete history, and a biased one at that, maybe that's the beginning of some sort of an atonement or reckoning. But I think it's an important quality for institutions to hold, that the whole story can never be told, and that it needs to make space, not to necessarily represent people, but to create space for people to represent themselves through self-expression, experience, through the agonistic pleasures of being together and the pains of those pleasures as well. But that the representation part is a difficult impossibility, and to admit that being partial or fragmented or incomplete is a positive, rather than offering a complete institutional history.
Marita?
I'm thinking through like their comments and coming at it in two ways. In some ways, I'm very much in sync with what has been said, and at the same time, I'm conflicted and I have a different perspective because of the institution I'm embedded in. Because my institution is culturally specific and it's embedded within a university that is also culturally specific. So it is like a museum whose strength is 20th century African American art, but not just any part of the 20th century. It's specifically the 1940s and the 1950s are our collection strength. And from its inception, it was created because Black artists did not have enough venues to present their work to the broader public. And so when they came together, they wanted to give artists of African descent, we say Black artists, but some were African American, some were from the Caribbean, some were from the continent of Africa, all participating in a jury competition so that they could really push their practice in a more expansive way, and also have it engaged seriously by a jury and held in the trust of the community, so that the future people of the future would be able to access this treasure trove of African American art. So in saying this, in kind of getting to your question about what is needed to survive and matter, what I appreciate about my institution is that we've survived now for almost 80 years. But we've survived because we've been embedded within a university, and that survival has meant being protected and mostly presenting our work in a very insular way, primarily to African Americans within a small section of Atlanta who were even aware of our existence. So we've survived fairly well, but the idea of, do we matter? And if we matter, to whom do we matter? We have yet to be in a space where we get serious media attention, criticism about our work, any sort of press or serious engagement with our practices, which from the beginning has been diverse within a very insular community, to use the language that I used before. And by that, what I mean, we've always been transnational in terms of dealing with other people of African descent and being in the backdrop or in the margins of broader artistic trends where we were not engaged. The benefit of that is that we have been able to be very creative and experimental. So when you're in an institution of this sort, what makes it really groundbreaking and what has allowed us to survive is when Black artists come to this space, they don't have to think of themselves as Black subjects or race subjects first. They can think of themselves as artists and figure out what their interests are and they have the ability to experiment and do things that they may not have been able to do in other contexts where they were framed in terms of their identities. So I think in terms of what we would need to survive in the future, and in some ways what we have is a model in terms of allowing people to come to the table in an experimental way and to be able to be fluid in how they understand themselves and their practice and how they would like to be represented to the larger world. I think museums have to craft space that allows artists to be that way regardless of their cultural background. At the same time, how do you make us matter? That's open-ended in terms of I'm sure there'll be a host of debates about what makes you matter. Internally as a community, we feel like we matter and we're very important. But more broadly, when I communicate with artists, the question is, how can we get more support for our work within the commercial side of the industry? And basically, how can we make a living? How do we matter in terms of training the next generation of professionals? Most of the students who attend Clark Atlanta University are first generation. So when I'm introducing them to this field and to museums in general, their question is, if I'm passionate about this, how do I survive? How can I make the world see that I matter enough so they would support me so that I would have a livable wage? So I think these are all things that we have to kind of think through in terms of what is necessary in terms of creating a healthy, strong, and vibrant arts and cultural environment for us to be able to thrive and move forward.
There's a lot. Thank you, all three of you. There's so much to unpack in what I just heard, you know, from thoughts and remarks about what it means to tell a whole or to be fragmentary, to Anya's point, to, you know, to kind of ruminating about economic structures, and which I heard you pointing to as well, Marita. And it's very interesting to me that in framing the question as mattering or survival, right away we see that those are not the same thing. And right away we see that this question of who, when you talk about mattering, well, to whom? You know, is it to the community right outside the doors of the museum? In your case, Marita, the community that museum was made for, or is it to a larger art world, which might, you know? And so I think that's real. We will dig into that because I think that's a big one. But I wanted to ask a follow-on question that was a little bit implied in some of your comments just now, and that is the three of you are in very different parts of the country, in very different cities, although all cities with sizable BiPOC communities. Anya's working in Detroit, and Terrence is working in New Haven, and Marita, you're working in Atlanta. I wanted to ask each of you to talk a little bit about how those locations and those cities with their particular communities and particular histories of enfranchisement and disenfranchisement from institutions has impacted your work or your thoughts about our topic today. Who would like to start? Marita, why don't you start us off there?
I mean, these are very interesting. This question is actually pretty loaded. I'll start by saying I'm an Atlanta native, born and bred. And so some of my things may be critiqued by my fellow Atlantans, but I say everything about my city in love. So first I will begin by saying the good thing about being in Atlanta as a city that has been at the center of developing leaders that deal with civil and human rights, such as Martin Luther King, John Lewis, people who have been very critical to how African Americans have been able to kind of deal with the problem of disenfranchisement. But when it comes to the arts, I think that Atlanta still struggles with this identity, and particularly its identity in the 21st century as a city that's in the American South that desperately wants to be in conversation with centers of power or cities in the North, particularly the Northeast, and particularly New York City, to the point where oftentimes we are not as experimental or as ambitious as we could be in terms of representing what we have to offer to the world with a very diverse population, not just in terms of Black and white dynamics, but this is truly an international city. But from the outside, I don't know that people get that message. and that they have a full understanding that we have an incredible international population that often gets forced to be collapsed into this black-white dynamic. And as a result, you even see that reflected in our cultural institutions. We are still heavily segregated. My institution is based on the southwest side of town, which historically was African-American, is undergoing gentrification, but there's still the remnants of that. And the people who support our institutions on this side of town tend to be of African descent. The other parts of town, as you move further north of the city, you begin to deal with other populations, but that become collapsed under being presumed to be quote unquote white, whatever that is supposed to be. And we completely miss oftentimes the contributions of the Latinx communities, the Asian communities, the Southeast Asians who are here. And so as a result, in thinking about the city of Atlanta, and what I think people need to take into consideration is that we are an incredibly vibrant urban southern city that has a lot to offer culturally and artistically, but we're kind of suppressed under this very stagnant discourse about the American South. And I think it informs how we do our work here, and we're in desperate need of growth and more confidence about what we have to offer to the world.
Thank you, Marita. Anya, what would you say in response to that question in terms of Detroit?
It is also for me a loaded question. While I'm not from Detroit, Detroit is a city for me whose image precedes it. And far before moving to Michigan, we understood the music, the vanguard cultural creations of the place. We understood it as a paradigmatically modern city that, really inflected the way sound was perceived globally. So its cultural production, its capacity to have accumulated capital at the heyday of modernism, really made quite an imprint on so many societies. It's also marred by modernism's failures and deals with those issues in very difficult ways. Like other cities, it's distinguished by a concentration of racialized space, but it's more visible because of the scale and the imprint of the city. And it's a city that is still coming out of a bankruptcy that has left lots of scars on communities. For me as an outsider to this context, it's always been very difficult to understand why Detroit didn't solve for its infrastructural issues by becoming a metropolis, by simply connecting the city with its more economically stable perimeter, and then being able to share in resources that would solve for many of its infrastructural problems. And the fact that it didn't over all of these years is a distinguishing factor in what we understand as barrier conditions that are difficult to cross. The institutions in the city are centralized. The capital that comes from philanthropy comes from the outskirts and is channeled in, and the communities that are in closest proximity to those institutions sometimes don't feel like they're serviced by the institutions that are on the interior. So that's a quick snapshot from my perspective.
Terrence.
It's funny, I'm not from New Haven. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina, where we used to pretend to have cousins from Atlanta. And a lot of my thinking about how institutions relate to their publics and the public-private issue was formed in graduate school when I was thinking about Detroit's bankruptcy and the ways that DIA was wrapped up in that. New Haven is Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great, interesting history here. Next Haven is located in Dixwell, a neighborhood in New Haven, which is historically Black, and used to be a jazz corridor up Dixwell Avenue, I believe. And the Black Panthers used to have, Bobby Seale used to live on the corner of Orchard and Henry Streets. I learned this from talking to Ray Stansel, who was working on construction on Next Haven's building, and he sort of shared a lot of the history there. New Haven had a lot of Black people move up from North and South Carolina during the Great Migration. The soul food here is excellent. And there were munitions factories, gun factories that employed a lot of people. And then they all left, they all went away. And there was a void after that. At the same time, Yale as a university has been growing and growing. And Yale is, it doesn't pay taxes on its land, and it has taken up more and more space, which means it's taken up more and more of part of the tax base in the city without giving anything back for it. Besides, some sort of middling scholarships for kids in high school, which is great, but not nearly close enough to the amount that Yale is costing the city. And so the way that much of that impacts Next Haven is, the first question you get is, what is this place? You sort of explain. And then the second question is it a Yale project? And it's important that Next Haven is not a Yale project. I think people are sort of ready for Yale to take up more space, to do more things that look good, but are not fundamentally changing the relationship of that institution with the city. And then Next Haven, it has its work cut out for it, I think, in trying to recognize Dixwell on Dixwell's terms. We're bringing in artists from all over the country, and I think it's going to take hard work to figure out what that means for Dixwell. But that's a challenge that the organization's up to.
I think we will hopefully hear more in a little bit about Next Haven and its particular model, how it's trying to kind of think and practice its way out of some of the conundrums of museums and institutions. But for now, I wanted to pick up on another thread that I kind of heard across the three comments, which is about the economic foundations of your three cities, and who's got power and resources and who doesn't. And I wanted to pivot a little bit to Anya in addressing that, at least first, because as Anya mentioned, when she began, she was born in the Soviet Union, and I know you spent your early years in Europe and therefore saw it very close hand, and you mentioned this a little bit in your overview, very different kinds of financial models for cultural organizations and for how they might be supported and sustained. So from the perspective of all three of you, is the change or the evolution that museums must undergo possible within capitalism? Does it require a very different kind of structure or structures than that? What do we think about that in terms of systemic change in art museums? Anya, would you start us off?
I don't know if I'll be able to solve for capitalism. But
that's okay. Maybe tomorrow, huh?
Right. But we often feel a tang of jealousy, say, for social democracies that invest a heck of a lot of resources in public funding towards art practices and institutions. And I often think about, in terms of number crunching, say France spends $240 per capita of federal funding on arts. And in the US, we spend 11. So isn't it so sad that we don't spend so much money? At the same time, creative practice in the US is very strong. And you could say market-driven creative practices are a colonial force to reckon with globally. We really export quite a bit of market-driven practices. And in the US at the same time, we really lean into philanthropic dollars in order to support arts and institutions. And what kind of baggage does that come with? Maybe the French model comes with its problem of nepotism, of top-down expression of power and control. In the American context, with philanthropic support for what we do, there's a high level of instrumentalization of arts in society, but in communities in particular. So there's no perfect system that can solve, but the sentiment that we might be able to better balance the relationship between collective, democratically processed federal funding or civic funding, and then combine that with the philanthropic dollars, we might get to a better outcome than what we have now. If not a perfect one, but a better one.
Terrence, what are your thoughts? And I wondered a little bit how this question intersects with some of what I know Next Haven has centered in its work, which is to have the artists and curators who come through there really understand and be exposed to the kind of underlying economics and social system of the art world and the art economy. So answer any way you want in terms of the larger art museum field and what's possible within capitalism or Next Haven and its particular path through these issues in terms of how it creates, a world in which it can help aspiring artists of color and curators survive and manage in that world.
Yeah, I separate my own politics from Next Haven's. I mean, I think that Next Haven does a great job of recognizing a gap in the artist's education in our sort of institutions is like, okay, but how do I sell this thing, right? Like, how do I turn this into a sustainable career? And so given the connections that Next Haven has, we're able to get these artists in front of people who can help them with that, while also letting them know, okay, here's how things tend to go, here's how to get some leverage, and helping them to survive within a system that would otherwise exploit them and might still, deep down, be incredibly exploitative, right? And I think that doing that it makes a claim that it is better for now for artists to be empowered within the system than for Next Haven to work actively to dismantle that system. Mm-hmm. So that's where we differ. I would say I would like to see wealth be disempowered, right? Like I would like to see the exploitation gone. I think that Next Haven is a realist organization. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking too that, I guess in sort of the political debate changing in the US over the last few years, pointing more toward, progressive ideas of the ways money should work, rethinking the collective versus, individualistic or oligarchical ways of thinking of things. I've always wondered, like, okay, what does an arts institution look like in that system? In Europe is a great example. And then I wonder too, I mean, again, I've gone from the National Gallery of Art to a very small, very young place that is deeply invested in what Titus Gaffar likes to say is the 4-block radius around it. What does that look like? What could that look like? That's an open question for me. And I want to know if it is right now better for artists to remain invested, but sort of wily and sort of vigilant in a more capitalist system. I would love to see an organization that also works to dismantle that, put itself out of business, basically.
Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about that yet, but the notion of institutions, although Anya kind of gestured toward it, like the notion of institutions that don't last forever and the idea of permanence, and whether we all have to envision all museums as living forever. But before we go there, maybe Marita, any thoughts on that question? Is it one that is?
I do, but I wonder if the fact that I'm situated within a university, how that impacts my perspective about it.
Yeah.
I think the models that were mentioned by Anya in Europe tend to apply more to civic museums or public institutions. And I don't know too many countries in Europe that have the types of university museums that we have here in the United States, and definitely not with the collections like we have at historically Black colleges and universities, which consist of, at this point, the leading canonical artists from the 19th century and 20th century. And then it tends to kind of wane post 1960s, maybe like early 1970s. But that wouldn't have been possible if we had not been embedded within a university that could sustain us during when the community didn't even see the value. And it even speaks to how we understand communities. Like, we hold these works in the hope that the broader communities, particularly in initially African-American communities, but anyone who has an investment or interest in African-American art would support it, but oftentimes that's not the case. I mean, the things that sustains my institution is the fact that our primary audience are students and faculty, and we use our collections to teach from and to develop art appreciation in the hope that it will filter out into the community. As of yet, this is still a very difficult practice or notion when many people approach painting, printing, printmaking, sculpture as things that are elitist or not necessarily of as great of interest in terms of Black cultural expression. There's more of an understanding of how to support music or how to support theater. But if we really think about who sustains us, it's the university complex that's bringing in money from the government, as well as from wealthy donors who want to support the institution writ large. So when I think about whether or not the notion of wealthy donor support and capitalism applies to my institution, it's kind of like one or two steps removed from the ways in which people sustain these economic models, insofar as people are sustaining the university, and by them sustaining the university, they sustain my institution. And I think that's been pretty effective in allowing us to protect a critical aspect of African-American heritage and culture that isn't necessarily always valued by the broader community because people don't yet know what to do with it. Not in the numbers that we would like for them to know. And only now do I believe nationally are we gaining traction as a result of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And even within that institution, the visual arts don't have the same primacy as performative arts do. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I'm just so struck by this, again, this question of mattering versus survival and value versus survival. I think that it would be very hard for anyone to argue with the profundity of the value of the Clark Atlanta University's gallery and what it preserved and how it sustained generations of artists. That's so obvious. It's so clear, especially now, to the point you just made. but that has not guaranteed its survival at every moment, right? Those two things have not been in sync throughout the history of the organization. And so,
and frankly, because we wouldn't necessarily be here today in light of what has happened just in the last year. I mean, we've been protected from some of the impact of coronavirus because we're at a university. And though our staff is very small, we have 2 full-time staff members and 1 part-time person, but whether or not we would be able to sustain the collection or our employees has never come up because we knew that we had the protection of the university. And so I really think that that has to be carefully considered when we think about economic models and the types of transformation that we would like in thinking about the future of art museums.
Right. In some ways, campus museums like yours and like Michigan's too are closer to a European model in that they have some protection they have a federal source of funding in the form of the university, and they have therefore some protection from just being at the kind of a victim of market forces. I'm conscious of the time, and I know that there's a lot of questions, so I think I'm going to pivot to one of my final questions, and that is this question of kind of sacred cows, this question of some of the aspects of museums that people really think and feel are immutable, or unchangeable, ideas about their permanence, for example, whether the permanence of the institution or the permanence of the collection, or ideas about keeping the market and value very separate. We could probably name a bunch of them, but they've come up in all of your comments in different ways. And I wondered if we could think about them a little bit. Can museums change in the ways they need to and hold on to all of those sacred cow values, practices, whatever, or do some of them really need to be done away with for us to make progress? Who wants to start? Terrence.
Thank you. I feel like I could list a bunch right now, but I've been interested lately in the ways that museums are. I think that, when we've had sort of large public debates about the value of institutions, I'm thinking of Detroit's bankruptcy and how some of the assets of DIA was in the city's name. I mean, they'd done that for years, right? Going back and forth. When DIA needed something and didn't have the money, they would ask the city. And I'm thinking of the Philip Guston exhibition postponement recently. And the public debate has been those with private interests saying this is an affront to art itself, that these things would be sold or that this exhibition would not happen. And what we're really talking about is the very particular art objects that are being held by institutions, or the very particular art objects that are at stake in, some exhibition or something. And art is much, much richer a thing than any collection of objects could hold. So what that makes me wonder is, how can institutions sort of recognize that their objects are, while powerful, merely objects and representative of their products of art, and that art is not necessarily something that is commodified. How do we recognize the ways that art as a level of mastery or as a way of thinking and putting things together is human? I think we talk about these objects as being about the essentially human, but we leave behind art. So yeah, I'm really interested in that.
So back a little bit to capitalism with the issue and problem of commodification. Anya or Marita, any thoughts before we turn it over to public questions on this one?
I feel, Marita, you have a closer.
Well, I partially want to just open it up because I think in some ways, to me, it's very much going to be context specific. You know, I think some of the sacred cows that people are ready to get rid of, certain institutions need to hold on to them a little bit longer. Right. I mean, because I do think there are times when, as Atlanta, again, being a city that doesn't do too well in terms of holding on to history sometimes, particularly in terms of architecture, like we are always ready to kind of move on and move with the times and destroy the past. But I think when it comes to certain collections and the ways that people used to think about objects or art as objects, and there's a way that we can maintain some of that in those core values and at the same time try to be fluid enough to expand and to kind of deal with where we are now. But I think there would be a lot of regret if we kind of released and just kind of decided to totally disrupt and dismantle what was before. And I can say that from the perspective that people only now are really beginning to value this collection here. I mean, the number of requests of people seeking works by Black artists from the 40s and 50s was phenomenal. And in the last 5 years, we've been sending work all over the world to Europe and Latin America because you can't find the work anywhere else. And so I wonder what would happen if an institution like mine was too quick to kind of push against and to kind of disrupt what has been when we've taken so long just to protect it. So that's essentially what I have in mind, but you know. Right.
So cautionary tale about, you know, the permanence and permanent collections can have, you know, their value goes up and down with history. And if you're, you know, not paying enough attention, you can get on the wrong side of that. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are in the chat. And this is one of them. How do we best advocate for change that is systemic and not performative? Who would like to take a stab at answering that?
I think that's a wonderful question. It's something that I think about a lot, particularly as I work with students and trying to prepare the next generation of professionals. And I think it's kind of a blend. I mean, particularly, again, this probably will be an unsatisfactory answer. But in terms of trying to deal with systemic change, first we have to like air out what is actually happening and creating a space that will allow for us to really look at some of the challenges that we are facing holistically, and to then begin to tackle them and honestly approach ways in which we're going to advance the field. Also, I think in terms of looking at museums and institutions, what has been most striking for me over the last year has been the extent to which people working within the field have been alienated, and we haven't given them enough space to be heard and to present alternative ways in which we could work. I think if we're really going to address systemic structural problems, it might help to start with people working within our institutions. And if we can address some of the internal issues, maybe we then can move forward to begin thinking about the broader communities or people outside of our institutions.
So systemic issues of governance and equity, and in ways that are not either performative only or in ways that are sustained. So changes to board structure and staffing structure.
But not only board structure and staffing structure, but really creating environments where people honestly feel that they can be heard. The number of museum professionals who don't truly feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to their institutions, or they don't feel that they're in a safe space, is striking. It's absolutely phenomenal. And the numbers who cannot maintain their practices because they don't have livable wages and they feel like they're very vulnerable is more than it should be. I think until people feel safe within our institutions, how can we make things safer or more equitable outside of our institutions? So the hierarchies and the problems are very much inside and internal as much as they are external. So.
Here's another question that actually is about external, so it's a good segue. How are communities who live in the vicinity of museums or are represented in the collections or who have been excluded from representation in the collections or students being involved in the decisions about, so the question is, how do those communities, how are they involved in the decisions about how to repair or rebuild art institutions? So it's a question about sharing decision-making and how museums do that, can do that, might do that.
I would say it's almost a question that's speculative because I can't point to an institution that's doing that as a model for how that could be done in sustainable and systemic ways. But thinking about not the space of single decision making or the next chapter of a particular institution, but rather thinking about how an institution might perpetually evolve has been sort of top of mind, because regardless of where you cut that moment and who you include in the conversation around certain decisions, others are invariably excluded. But a more robust way is to consistently keep space and make space for continued engagement, continued evolution. That's that doesn't necessarily hinge on a particular group of people that are involved. So yeah, in some ways, this brings me back to this question that you asked earlier, Tina, about about the sacred cow, and I was sort of grappling with it ever since. But
yeah,
it's a very unpopular idea among architects, but I think the desanctification of architecture is an important first step, that the container is something that needs to keep space in a raw, unfinished condition so that it can constantly be inflected by those in the vicinity, those who are excited and have an energy toward the institution, and young people who are emergent, artists, designers, curators, to have a place of self-expression.
And I would add to that, in at least at Clark Atlanta, the way I've tried to work with students and emerging professionals has been such that they can bring their ideas to the table and we can see what can be implemented, and at the same time protect the collection as well as the space that we have available. And often I think it allows us to have more interesting exhibitions, programs, when we find that, or when not we, I still this is we, it's me, okay, because I'm the director. But so essentially, when I take the time to bring the students to the table and to bring like young professionals and ask them, what would you like to see in this space? What could we do to make you feel like you're a part of it? I find that all of the exhibitions and the programs tend to be more innovative. The students and my staff and my volunteers, because of the nature of the space that we're in, we have to do everything. And as a result, we talk about, from the way we install a space, how we decide what we're going to deal with, and it's just something that necessarily is a little bit more egalitarian than I've experienced in other institutions that have a much larger staff. But I don't know that that would be sustainable if I said, even if I had like a staff of 40. It's easy to do that when you have 5 people at the table. It's a whole nother animal when you start kind of doubling, tripling, or quadrupling that, and then beginning to think through what that would mean. But with that said, we are very weak and very bad at necessarily extending beyond the reach of our campus to go to delve into the needs and the desires of the community. And so that's something that I think would be interesting to hear from others. How do they get beyond their usual constituencies to find out what is of interest, and at the same time protect the core values of the institution and the collections that we're stewards of? So.
Yeah, there's a lot we could follow those two very interesting comments with. I was struck by both of them, both Marita, your comments about, well, I'm the director, you know, and so like what's the core part that we back to that, we are not willing to violate. And then also by Anya's point about the desanctification of architecture. And I'm going to follow on that one because there is an interesting architecture question in the chat. And I know we're running out of time, but I want to serve this one up. And here it is. Museum facades, which feature columns and other Greek and Roman revival architectural elements, serve as a visual representation of colonialism and reinforce a psychological barrier to access for people and groups with minority identities. How can institutions repair this harm?
I love this question so much.
I have one of those museums, so I love it too.
So, I mean, it's a question that one of my favorite museums is the Museum to Integration in Paris. And it's built on the bones of the Musée d'Orsay, which is the site of colonial power and prowess in Paris. Every inch of that facade is covered in reliefs that illustrate the global extraction of the French government over hundreds of years. And it's the most pained and difficult building I've ever seen. And it was transformed into the Museum to Immigration. And there was an architect charged with either making a case for blowing up that facade or transforming it in meaningful ways. And the decision was made to juxtapose, to live with the historical remnants, regardless how difficult, as an anti-monument to the things that have happened, and to layer them with contemporary, meaningful transformations by artists and architects that inflected the meaning of that place and built on the bones. I think there are many ways that we can start to scratch away to decolonize, but also reimagine the elements of order that situate us in architecture and space, and leaving some trace of what those things are that marked us. I think it's an important reality of the fact that you can't just start tabula rasa. You're always building on the difficult histories that make us a society. So there's no simple solution. I think it's deeply contextual. I think that there are some, very brutal historical elements that are difficult to take and difficult to leave. And others sometimes are just reminders of where we've come from that are integrated into a future, self-reflexive future.
Yeah, please.
Say, may I add, I think that, yes, many conventions we have, signify certain things for us. And a way to think about repairing is we don't have to apologize for the same thing forever. Like, the columns have meant a certain thing. What can they mean in the future is a question for me. How can we help them mean something else by perhaps giving ownership over to other people, or allowing some sort of allowing constituents to sort of recalibrate their own relationship to these things. We're not, we got to the psychological state we are through a constructed society. We can construct a new one.
And I agree in terms of constructing new narratives or inserting different forms of expression within the spaces. I mean, we know that there our hierarchies and ways that people have interpreted these older structures. I mean, we're in a building from the 1930s with the columns and, you know, very detailed kind of filigree and various stuff that people absolutely love. But I think what has helped is that we've started to talk about the development of African-American art along a continuum. And what has been really nice is that we're looking at all forms of expression in terms of taking in like things that were historically perceived as crafts, and this, as though they should not be juxtaposed with the fine arts, and we present them all together. And as a result, I believe that's been one of the most positive things we could have come up with within the last 2 years, to not only show traditional African art, crafts from people in the American South, and works that were associated with modernism collectively in the same space, and show how they're all in communication with each other. And it gives people a different sort of sensibility when they enter the space and when they engage with the works of art. So.
And in fact, that was one of the next questions that had come in, was exactly on this topic of, you know, little a, big A arts, and the differences between art and craft, and whether those distinctions themselves are rooted in racism and classism, which I think we would all probably argue they are. And should museums do away with those kinds of distinctions? Should they be more Catholic and broader in what they think of as visual culture, for example? That's not quite the question, but I think that's part of where the question is going. So I know your answer on that, Marita, just having heard you right now. But any response, Terrence or Anya, to that kind of question of what museums, art museums collect? What's considered art? What's considered worth holding on to forever?
I think it's important to examine the stakes of that question, because look at like the G's Bin quilts, for example, right? Like they're coming into collections, they're being hung up like modernist paintings. It's all well and good, but how are the artists doing? Are these objects being brought in and being treated like objects that have you know, been like drawn into a capitalist system and have disenfranchised their makers? I don't want that. So I do want more and different kinds of objects to be respected by institutions, but I also want to change the terms in which that respect is expressed.
I am very touched by the way you're talking about this, Terrence. I also see that publics no longer quite believe in the difference between art and other popular creative industries, but to transform those other creative industries simply into commodities that then are recycled into the same infrastructure that is the holding container seems like a missed opportunity to make a distinction between collections and collectivity and sustaining the activity of the collective. So yeah, if there's some way for us to imagine how the museum might be that middle interface that helps sustain a plethora of emergent artists and artistic practices, rather than simply the objects that they make, could begin to find that interstitial space between the top-down funding of our cultural activity and the bottom-up activities that are instrumentalized by philanthropy.
But I think that's what's interesting about looking to contemporary artists, particularly in the American South. A lot of the artists that are emerging now are disrupting these ideas and very much looking at older textile and kind of crafts traditions to create new bodies of work. And so it's always kind of at the forefront of our mind, like looking at these former categories in completely new ways as a result or out of necessity of engaging the practices of contemporary artists who are in the South. I just think there's no way we can have this complete separation or this false separation that was there before. And in looking at African American expression, it never really seems to have held true or to have been the case. So that would be the only other thing that I would say. But in that regard, I do think our institutions have a way of supporting those artists who are doing the work and ensuring that we're not just taking their practices and their works and not giving them the necessary support that they need as well. And so, yeah.
I think on that very, very strong point, we are going to have to end because we are out of time. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I hope all of you have as well. I think it's been really rich. Of course, we could talk for another 2 days, but we'll do it again. I'd like to thank Anya Sirota and Terrence Washington and Marita Poole, our 3 really terrific panelists. I'd also like to thank Allison Rivet for helping organize today's program. And I would encourage all of you to subscribe to the newsletter so that we can keep you apprised of future of art programs, and stay warm and dry. And thanks again for coming tonight.